Facilities Assessment Report webinar. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We are also joined today, and I'm going to start sharing a big slide deck in just a moment, but we're joined by Bob Donahue on my team. You all know me, Jill Briggs Campbell, and my title has changed, which is exciting because it now reflects my job. So I'm now the operations, AOE operations manager or director. So that's exciting news. And we still have Bob Donahue, our school facilities program manager. We're also joined by the team from Bureau Veritas. So Tom, if you want to wave, and Anthony, and they'll be presenting. And then also many of you know Marty. Marty, if you want to wave. Marty's from PCI, but he's also been supporting this school facilities assessment as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the slide deck. Reminder, folks, you can put questions in the chat. We will have kind of a Q&A section at the end. And so while I usually am pretty informal and tell you all jump in, if there's something specific, if you want to put the question in the chat, and then we can open up for Q&A at the end, I think is probably the best way to go here, because we're going to cover a lot of information, and I suspect that a lot of your questions will be answered during the webinar. So if you can just bear with, and we'll do that towards the end. So all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share slide deck. And you all tell me if you can see the slide deck.
Yes.
Yes, give you a thumbs up. All right, great. Well, now I can't see my own screen. Hang on one second. I'm going to try that one more time. All right. So what we're talking about today, again, is the Act 72 School Facilities Assessment Reports. Many of you are starting to receive those. Bob has been sending them out as sort of a SUSD packet as they become available. He's going to be pushing them out today, tomorrow, over the next couple of days, and you'll have a chance to digest them. We also will be sending out a cover letter. So if you already received your reports, you'll get that cover letter to go with them. We, in the interest of just getting this information out to you as soon as possible, we're pushing the reports out as they were being finalized. But everyone will have that cover letter, and also we'll be posting a lot of information up on our AOE website in the coming days. So be aware, more info to come. Our agenda today is that I wanted to sort of set the framework and remind us all of sort of the background and purpose. What were the objectives of this statewide school facilities assessment project and its kind of origin in Act 72. Some kind of high level considerations when you are reviewing and using these reports. And then we'll kick it over to Tom from the Bureau Veritas, I just call him BBTA team, to give you an overview of the assessment process, key definitions within the report, other aspects of the report. We'll also briefly talk about a process for addressing errors if you find factual errors, but also just updates that need to be made. And then we'll talk about next steps in Act 72 and the facilities assessment. So there's a lot more to come. So that's our agenda. As I said at the beginning, I'm here today. I'm joined by Bob Donahue, our school facilities program manager. From BBTA, we have Tom Bart and Anthony Connor, and then we also have Marty Spalding from PCI. Sorry, Marty, I didn't have you on the slide here. So I want to take us back in time a little bit and sort of, again, set the framework for the origins of this statewide school facilities assessment. It's the first time that this has been undertaken. I'll say that it's something that is other states have done, but not all of them. So this is something that we see across a lot of states, but really doing it in this comprehensive manner is somewhat unusual. So we want to go back, way back to 2007 the iPhone was just coming out, I think, when the Vermont General Assembly, looking at sort of the changing economic picture, suspended our state school construction aid program. And then that was resuspended in 2008 on sort of a more permanent basis, and has not, as we all know, we've been talking about this a lot, has not been sort of restarted or unsuspended over the past 16 years. And we all, again, we talk about this quite a lot. We know that this lack of state support, and then also the challenges that you all face in your local budgeting process. We know that there's been a growing backlog of deferred maintenance and large-scale renovation projects. In 2021, this issue was taken up in earnest in the General Assembly, and a lot of folks that are on this call today, including Jeff Francis, at the time Secretary French, and other folks like Bruce McIntyre, Dave Epstein, were really front and center sort of advocating that we needed to address the needs and conditions of our public school facilities within the state. And what came out of this conversation was what I think of sort of as an omnibus bill, Act 72. And you all have seen a lot of presentations from me over the past couple of years around all of the elements in Act 72, but they're all driving towards this sort of strategic plan and goal of understanding the condition, the current condition of our public school buildings, and with this sort of fundamental belief that I think is probably shared by everyone, particularly on this call, that if one of our goals is that all students have equitable access to high quality education, that must include school facilities as well. And Act 72 has many, many elements. I'm always happy to go into them, but we don't need to for the purpose of today. But it's all sort of driving towards this goal of trying to ensure that all of our school facilities meet sort of a high standard. So one of the things that was identified in this conversation on Act 72 is that there was very little, and I'm going to go so far as to say no, state level awareness of the condition of school facilities. Part of the loss of the statewide school construction aid program is that we no longer had staff within the agency that was tasked with this, even sort of tangential work around this, that we knew that we didn't have sort of state level standards, and that really we didn't have information. And so one of the critical pieces of Act 72 was a directive to the AOE that we conduct a facilities assessment of the statewide portfolio of school buildings. In order to support that, the agency used some of its ARPESER state level funding. And as you all know, about 2 years ago, the sort of initial pass at this, which was undertaken by our partners from BBTA, was a self-reported facilities inventory, which gave us sort of that first pass of information, and then followed up by this more comprehensive facilities assessment. So that work was undertaken this year, and the assessments were completed, and the final reports are now going out. We've identified that there was a couple schools on the list that were missed, and BBTA is in the process of ensuring that all public schools will have their reports by the end of this year. So that's the background. Why are we doing this? We've sort of identified a couple of critical things, and I think that this is a really important framework when you all are digesting, reviewing, and then using these facility assessment reports. And we also want to talk about, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more during this webinar today, that you'll hear me say this a couple of times, the reports are a key first step. They're like the salad course, but the entree is actually the larger set of data that's come out of these facilities assessments. And the database that sits behind it, which is called Asset Calc, is actually like the main course. And the work that is going to flow from this collection of baseline data and then the ongoing updating of this information is really going to be the key thing that's going to drive kind of our sort of next phase of work. So I think that's really important because while we want to acknowledge that the production of these reports is like a really important milestone and that a lot of work and effort, both on your part, our partners at BVTA, the AOE has gone into this, it's the first step of a much longer process. So that's important. So again, this facilities assessment was undertaken to gather baseline data as to the overall health of school facilities. It was also a recognition on the part of the General Assembly that not all districts are equally resourced. Some of you all have undertaken really comprehensive, in-depth facilities assessments in like the recent past, and that is fantastic, but we have to acknowledge that not everybody has those resources. So a statewide assessment allows for all school districts to have equitable access and through a comparable assessment methodology, right? We're all using the same terms and the same sort of industry standards. In addition, the data that has been generated as the result of this facilities assessment work is going to inform two key pieces of work. One of them is underway, and we've already started to use this sort of aggregate data, not like detailed level system building level reports, but in aggregate, we've started using this data in the School Construction Aid Task Force, which is working right now, and potentially will help to inform the General Assembly in the next legislative session and maybe the one after that, should it undertake a state school construction aid program. And Bob Donahue has done a lot of really helpful work sort of modeling what is kind of the immediate need for our school facilities, what's the long-term, you know, sort of 5-year replacement cost, 10-year replacement cost, and this information is being really used in that school construction aid task force right now. In addition, the data is going to reside in a database called Asset Calc that the state, and by extension, all of you will have access to in perpetuity. And this is going to be critically important as you all are developing the 5-year capital improvement plans that are required in Act 72 and in the district quality standards. And Bob is already working with the BVTA team and working with some business managers in the field to sort of test drive how we can take the data that's already sitting in Asset Calc and use it to sort of spit out 5-year capital improvement plans that all of you can have access to as you're looking at your long-term planning for replacements and capital expenditures. So this is going to be, and you know, in your budgeting and the conversations that you all need to have around local annual budgets. So that's sort of the big purposes of doing this work in a nutshell. And then the last section before I kick it over to Tom is things to sort of consider as you're looking at these reports. So by design, the statewide facilities assessment is intended to be the beginning of a long-term effort to address deficiencies in school facilities. This is not the end point. This is the start of the much longer process. It is important to acknowledge what the reports are and what they aren't, right? So the reports, the physical PDF, I guess it's a virtual PDF, but you know, the report itself is a reflection of a point in time assessment, and it was conducted over a short period of time using established industry standards and definitions. And we want to sort of acknowledge that just as you all are bound by the timeframes of your ARPESR dollars, so too is the Agency of Education. And so there was a need to get this work conducted on a fairly short time frame and to get that sort of point in time first pass of a statewide look at these systems. Also critically, these assessments are a higher level look and provide a means for relative ranking of buildings across a large portfolio of buildings and are not intended to have great specificity. And then finally, for those of you who have already undertaken facilities assessments on their own, potentially because you're looking at major construction or long-term capital planning, the data generated from this current round of assessments can be viewed as supplemental and shouldn't replace those much more in-depth kinds of assessments that you undertake when you're looking at major construction, which might include soil sampling, engineering assessments, and all kinds of other considerations. So these should be, again, viewed as supplemental and part of a much larger statewide framework and not necessarily replacing or contradicting your own comprehensive assessments. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to now shift it over to Tom. And Tom, if you just want to tell me when to advance the slide, I will be available to do that. And I will happily stop talking because I'm starting to lose my voice. Tom, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Jill. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. What I want to do for the next half hour or so is walk through the context of the report you're going to get and explain kind of what you're seeing, what things mean, what some of the definitions are, some of the detailed information, and we'll get into some of the technical aspects of it. So there's just good understanding of what you're reading, what it means, and how you can interpret it. I actually want to thank Jill and Bob specifically for their really excellent collaboration in this program. We've been at this more than a year, and it's really unbelievable how much we've achieved. We visited 375 schools in the state of Vermont. I also want to acknowledge Marty from PCI and their role in particularly in the PCB analysis, the size verification of the schools, and many of the other things that took place. This was a huge effort from a lot of different people, and you're seeing the results of it now. The scope in general, when we talk about a facility condition assessment, includes an evaluation of all the systems that comprise the building. And I'll go through a little bit about what that was, how that took place as a recap. But that really evolves into a deferred maintenance plan and a short-term needs assessment. It also involves a long-term capital plan. So you're looking at things that are broken or defective today or near the end of their life, but you're also looking 5, 10, even 15 or 20 years into the future to plan for the renewal, replacement, or refurbishment of major systems. We also conducted a substantial energy audit, and and a lot of you were involved in pulling together your energy information, your consumption data, utility metering information, all that. We certainly appreciate all the efforts that everybody went to in helping to provide the information that informed this. The PCB analysis was conducted separately, but we did incorporate those findings into the report. We'll talk a little bit about how we dealt with that if there were findings that were above the legal level. We also did a modest STEM STEAM evaluation, which was essentially a checklist that calibrated what types of STEM STEAM accommodations each school had, and there's a score that went along with that. Capacity was self-provided by the schools, and so we've got a statement of that. And then, of course, PCI again did takeoffs and verified the size of the buildings that were reported by the state. By the way, the school you're seeing on the slide here is not a school in Vermont. This is actually a school in Gardner, New York, which is where I grew up, and this is where I went to kindergarten and first grade. This is was called the Gardner School. So I don't know how many people today who truly went to a two-room schoolhouse, but I'm actually one of them. And interestingly enough, they did close that school probably 5 years after I attended it, and it became the town offices and courthouse. Many years later, I found myself in front of a judge answering to a traffic infraction, and I apparently had a smile on my face because the judge asked me what was so funny, and I said, well, I just used to take my naps where you're sitting. So he ended up letting me off the ticket, and that was I think that was an advantage for me. But anyway, the reason I put that slide up is the photo rather. I'm reminded when I was young and went to school, and the sort of innocence that goes with youth and the opportunity that comes with education. And I never thought when I was young about the building I was in, or whether it was hot or cold, or where the lunches came from, or anything like that. I took that for granted, and I think that children should be able to. They should be, focused on the education aspect and not so much, having to worry about problems that may result as a result of facilities. So as we went through this process, and as we continue to go through, I'm just reminded. I try to remind myself every day as to why we're doing this, and ultimately, it's for the children and for the future of the country and in the state of Vermont in this case. So, next slide, Joe. So a little bit about the methodology. Every building, is collectively comprised by numerous types of systems. And Joe, if you can just kind of click here like every 10 seconds. The site and infrastructure is part of the assessment. So we're looking at things that are in the surround of the building, sidewalks, roadways, drainage, all those sorts of things. And for every one of these systems, we're identifying what it is, when we think it was relatively installed, and how many years of remaining useful life we think it has, serviceable remaining life. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, what we mean by various failure modes. In addition to site and infrastructure, we also do the exterior envelope. And these are things that keep wind and water and cold out and keep heat in. That's the walls, the doors, the windows, roofing, and so forth. We also look at the MEP systems, the heating, the cooling, fire suppression, plumbing systems, all the things that are kind of behind closed doors that a lot of people don't even see or even really aware of every day. But those tend to be systems that are critical when they go down. People know it because you can't be in a school that in January that's very cold, obviously, and so forth. Next, Joe. I think we can click a couple here. Interiors as well. We're also looking at wall finishes, ceiling finishes, floor finishes. And again, for every one of these systems, we're identifying what type it is, how long when it was installed, how long it should have left in a serviceable fashion, and also replacement costs for that's based on industry standards. And again, I already talked about the mechanical, MEP, and electrical systems. So if you haven't already gotten your report, you will be getting it shortly. And this is just the cover page. It'll look like this, have a photo of the building and some information about it. Table of contents tells you what's obviously in the report. And we're going to go through these in a fair amount of detail so that when you get the report and start looking through it, you'll know what to expect when you get to the various sections. And it starts with sort of a snapshot of what the building is, when it was developed, when it was constructed, how large it is, things like the number of stories and all that. And it's really just identifying what's there. Here's your building, and here's generally what it looks like. After that, there'll be a narrative description, next slide, Joe, of basically what's there in a narrative fashion. Some statements about condition here, not intended to encapsulate all of the findings, but just sort of general findings and description of what's there in the building. And from there, the report goes really from what I would call the general to the specific, and you'll see that as we go through the next several slides here about what's in the report. So I want to talk next about a little bit of terminology. So what are you going to see, how things are classified? So first is about condition. Now, obviously, there's different ways to characterize what condition something is in. And one of the ways is descriptive terms here. So we have excellent, good, fair, poor, and failed. And you can read in, the language here as to what we mean by that. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think mean different things to different people. So first of all, we all understand excellent and good. Fair, though, I think sometimes people think fair is a negative reflection about a system. And that's really not the case in this context. Fair means that the equipment is serviceable. It's certainly not new. It's somewhere in its life cycle, but it's basically working and doesn't necessarily need any attention today. But at some point, it's going to continue to age and go from that fair to poor. And that's really where, when you're looking at the life cycle of your systems, when your systems are going from that fair to poor range, that's when you really need to start thinking about planning for a refurbishment or replacement. Poor, I think we all understand what that means. But I want to talk a little bit about failed. And there's always consternation about what the word failed means. Now, I think we all understand that something that breaks and ceases to work, like you drop a light bulb on the floor, certainly that bulb has failed. But most systems and buildings don't fail in that way. They don't deteriorate and break and cease to work. The question really becomes, are they fulfilling the purpose that they were designed to fulfill? And if they're not, there could be a couple of reasons. It could be condition. It could be actual failure of certain components. It could be that they're not sized properly, or it could be that they're simply maxed out or have lack of redundancy, things like that. So an example of that would be an electrical system that technically is working, but it's really insufficient. It's aged. There are ongoing problems with it. Parts and supplies are difficult or expensive to procure. And you may actually say that even though a system is working, in other words, you go into the building, the lights are on, the heat's working because the electrical is there, the system is on the verge of failure or is failing. So when you read some of the terms in the report, keep an open mind about what we mean there. It's not intended to be some reflection about the level of maintenance or operation of the building. It's really just, how old is this and when should you be thinking about replacing it? Okay, next slide, Joe. So we also talk about plan type. So for each of the findings in the report, you're going to see them associated with one of the following plan types. And we really use what we call a top-down approach on these. In other words, the assessors, when they're looking at each finding, if it's a safety-related issue, that's what they should pick first. The plan type is intended to indicate sort of the reason or nature of the recommendation, like why is this an issue? And so and many times it could be more than one. For example, you could have an issue that's related to safety, but also has energy impact or environmental impact, and also is at the end of its life cycle. So it could actually be 3 plan types that really would drive that. But the top-down approach is we pick the one that is the most important. Certainly, if there's a safety issue, we want to call that out. We understand what safety is. Performance integrity is used to indicate when something actually is not functioning, is broken or about to break. Accessibility is related to ADA, people being able to get to the serviceable areas in the building, things like that. Environmental could be related to actually, damage to the geographic environment, or could be environmental within the school, things like mold and so forth, for example. Retrofit adaptation would be really an attempt to modernize. If you had a coal-fired boiler, let's say, then we wouldn't recommend that you necessarily replace it with a coal-fired boiler. We'd recommend something different. And then the vast majority of what you're going to see in the findings is things associated with life cycle renewal, because most things are somewhere in their life cycle functional, but at some point in the future, they're going to require replacement or refurbishment. And so next we talk about immediate needs and key findings. So again, going from the general to the specific, the first thing you're going to see in immediate needs are the things that we found that are, pressing issues. These are things that you should be looking at, right away, not necessarily that they're critical or dangerous, although sometimes they could be. But generally, if it was a safety related issue, we would have probably already made you aware of that. But these are things that are going to cause some sort of failure or problematic issues in the very near term. And those are things you want to focus on pretty quickly. Key findings are similar, where immediate needs are like immediate year 0, year 1. In other words, it's already broken or we think it's about to break. Key findings are in really the next 2 to 3 years after that, and also just sort of general significant findings about the building. So if you're going to, the first thing you do when you read the report is say, well, what's the punchline here? You're going to find that in your immediate needs and key findings. Next, I want to talk about, and this is an example, by the way, of the immediate needs. And here in this building, there's actually only 2 that are near term. Your list might be a little bit longer, or you actually may not have any if the school's newer in particular, or has undergone a near-term refurbishment, let's say. And then an example of key findings would be, something like this. And you'll see these enumerated with a photograph, some information about them, cost estimate, and so forth. So next we get to the metrics, okay? And this is really the conditional indicator of each building. And there's a term in the business called the Facility Condition Index, known as FCI. And very simply, it's a ratio or a fraction, if you will, where the numerator of the fraction is the sum of what we call deferred maintenance, the cost of things that are either broken today or we project will be broken or have some element of failure within the next year. All right, we call that deferred maintenance. Things that are 2 to 3, 4 years away, they don't go into the FCI yet. And you'll see in a moment that as we advance the FCI through the life cycle projections, we forecast what happens to the FCI over time. But the numerator is the sum of the deferred maintenance. The denominator is what we call the current replacement value. And that is simply the replacement cost of the systems in the building, not necessarily the cost to build a new building, but really the total cost of the systems in the building is the denominator. And so it's a ratio of what percentage of the things that I own in the building are currently broken or about to fail, right? So I always like to use the analogy of a car. If my car is worth $10,000, which I know is very low in today's world, but and I need $500 worth of repair, then I have a pretty low FCI. It's 500 divided by 10,000. But if I need $5,000 worth of repair, then I'm approaching a 50% FCI, and that's obviously not a good situation. That's a situation you don't want to be in. So you can see here in the ranges of FCI, 0 to 5% is a good indicator of how well maintained the building is. And again, it's driven by the deferred maintenance, things that are broken or about to break, right? And so you could have a lot of systems. You could be in a building that's quite old and experiencing deterioration, but it's also functional. And so you're not necessarily going to see a high FCI based on that. And then we'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But as you get into the 5 to 10% of the value of the building, 10 to 30%, certainly you can understand that when you see that much deferred maintenance, the building starts to become non-functional. And so we're obviously trying to drive condition down under 5%. And so you see more about that in the metrics. Next slide shows, and this is an actual example of one of the schools here, what the FCI is in this building. And so you can see the replacement value is pegged at $4 million. The square footage is 16,000 square feet, and the cost per square foot of the replacement value is $250 per square foot. As a result of what we found in the school today, the FCI is 2.2%. That's a good condition index. That's not a poor condition facility. That's a good condition facility today. If we look at the 3-year, in other words, we look forward into the future and look at the remaining useful lives of those systems we looked at, now we see that it starts to climb up to 3%. And if you get 5 years, now you're at 7%. And this is without spending any money, without fixing anything, just allowing the system to deteriorate. You'll see that the condition starts to get worse. You probably have already noticed that the higher the condition, the higher the percent, the worse the condition. Okay. And then when you get into the 10-year window here, if you didn't spend any money on this building in 10 years, you'd be looking at a 20% facility condition index, which is getting to be a very poor condition facility. So what does that mean? Not a surprise that we need to spend money on facilities going forward, because every piece of equipment in the system has a life cycle and is eventually going to fail at some level. And so here, that's what we've done, is just capture that information and projected what the timing of those things look like.
Hey, Tom, it's Jill.
Yeah.
So if I am receiving my report right now and it says that my FCI is 30% or above, while that might feel like, oh, well, 30%, that's not very high. But what we're actually saying is, looking at the building as a whole right now, a third of your systems are in, needing to be replaced, right? So that's actually a 30% and above is actually a quite poor condition, right?
That's right.
Okay. All right. I think that's helpful, because I think a lot of folks, when we did the inventory, what they sort of were self-reporting, and then what was generated out was like a 70, and all of a sudden with the assessments they're seeing a lower number. And could you maybe just take a moment and speak to why there'd be a difference in those two numbers and how folks can help to communicate what that difference means?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what the next couple of slides talk about. And so we're going to get pretty technical here for a moment and explain exactly why those numbers are different. So this is a representation, and just what I just said about the FCI, what happens to the FCI over time. So the FCI in this case is represented by the red line, and you can see that it's, and I know this is a little small to read, but it starts at 2.2%, and in 10 years it's up to 20-something%. The bars are the funding, the amount of dollars in the deferred maintenance backlog that's driving that FCI. The blue is the funding that actually would be required in that year, and the gray is the cumulative effect of all the blue bars, just showing how that happens over time. And so the next metric that we talked about, and I'll get into answering Jill's question here, I think, through the next two slides, is the depleted value index. Now, when we did phase one and all the information was self-reported, we weren't asking you to tell us whether things were failed or broken. We were just simply asking to tell us when they were installed and how much life they had left in them. And that's really what we like to call the depleted value index, or the percent of the percent used. Okay, one is the inverse of the other. So let's just say if a system had a expected useful life of 20 years and it was 10 years old, all other things being equal, that would be 50% of its life consumed and 50% of its life remaining. Okay, if it was a 20-year life cycle and it had 5 years remaining, okay, then 75% of its life will have been consumed and it would have 25% of its life remaining. Okay, so in this case, we're saying that the depleted value index is that 36.7% of the life has been depleted, and that 64 or 63.3 would be remaining. Okay, so the reason that matters is that think of it in terms of like a light switch. Okay, the FCI is either it's on or off. It's either failed or not failed. Okay, if it's failed or about to fail, then it hits the FCI. If it hasn't, even if it's got 2 to 3 years remaining and is approaching failure, it's still not included in the FCI. Okay, the FCI is real. That is the things that are broken that you need to jump on right away. The depleted value index is really just a matter of how consumed the building is as a whole as a result of how consumed each system is. So again, thinking about the car example, you have tires on your car, and those tires are expected to last, let's say, 40,000 miles, if you believe the manufacturer's claims. And you have 20,000 miles on those tires. There's nothing wrong with the tires. They work, they perform, they're probably in fair condition, but they're not going to be in your FCI. They're going to have a zero cost because you don't need to spend any money on tires today. However, we are going to say that those tires are 50% consumed. And so in the phase one analysis, we were really looking at the depleted value index. When you saw a high depleted value index in your phase one, what you're saying is you're working in a building that's pretty old. The systems are old and aged. They may be functional, but they're not new. And that's really the difference. Again, the FCI is when you have broken systems or systems that are really just on the verge of failure that don't work and need immediate investment and renewal. And that's really the difference. If you look at I think the 3 and the 5 year FCI, if you think about what happens in the FCI over time, 3, 5, 10 years, that's really the combination of your depleted value index and your FCI tells you where you are in the grand scheme of things, right? And if you have low FCI and a low depleted value index, then you're probably in a pretty new building or a building, again, that was recently refurbished. If you're in a building that has a low FCI but a high depleted value index, then you're in a building where you're doing a good job at maintaining what you have, but what you have is old, and it's going to become a problem in the future without major reinvestment. So hopefully that all makes sense. And this is really just an example of how that all plays out. This is not something you'll see in the report, but this is something that I put together to really kind of explain the difference between the two. So at the top here, you see, if you focus to the right, you see 1-year DM, 3-year DM, 10-year DM. That's deferred maintenance. That's the numerator of the facility condition index, okay? That's the sum of things. And this is a generic example. You see system 1 through 6 on the left. All right, you're going to have, obviously, a lot of systems in your building. It's going to be a lot more than 6. But this is really just for an example. Each system has a cost, has an expected useful life, and a remaining useful life. And so in year 1, you can see that system 1 it has 1 year remaining. So that's going to hit your FCI. That's going to hit your deferred maintenance. System 2 has a 3-year remaining useful life. And so that's going to hit your 3-year FCI, and so forth and so on. But the depleted value index, you can see, is based on what percent of the life is left. So in system 1, the cost of that system being $50,000, you've actually consumed $45,000 of that value just strictly through age, because it's only got 1 year life left. And so when you add all that up, if you look at the bottom, you'll see the 1 year, 3-year, and 10-year FCIs that are low but climbing. And then you see the depleted value index of 50%. And that's a pretty typical case. A lot of systems, if you think about it, it's normal to have a depleted value around 50%, because you're going to live with systems as long as you can, because you've invested them. You want them to last as long as you can. But at some point, you're going to have to replace them. And so for a building that's, let's say 20 years or older, it's very normal to have a depleted value index of around 50%. The higher that gets, the more problematic it becomes. And that's just the way the math works out. So hopefully that helps explain the difference between the two. I think you have to look at both. Certainly the FCI progression is important, but knowing like how old your building is and how collectively consumed the systems are also tells you something about what's coming in the future. So hopefully, Joe, that helped. I know it's pretty technical,
Yeah.
but that's how the math works.
Yeah, and just for folks' awareness, Tom has explained this to me at least 4 times over the past year, and I'm finally getting it. So don't worry if it's all Greek. But yes, Tom, that's really helpful. Thank you.
And I really like the light switch analogy that the FCI is either on or off. The switch is on or it's off. It's either in the FCI or it's not. The depleted value index is the dimmer switch. How bright is the light, right? And so if your dimmer switch is halfway up, that's sort of what that means in terms of condition. Hopefully that helps.
Tom, you've got 2 questions there that relate to this section. Did you want to address those now?
I'm okay with that. Jill, if you're okay with it.
Yeah, if it's specific to this section, absolutely. And thank you, Anthony. I can't see the chat, so go right ahead. If you want to, Anthony, if you want to read the questions in the chat and then Tom can respond to them, that would be great.
Okay. Bruce McIntyre asked the question, $250 a square foot is not a reasonable number. And the second question is from Michael Briggs, how is BVTA developing cost and what are they using as a cost database?
Okay. Yeah. So I agree. You can't build a school building for $250. And that's true. But remember, what we're trying to do here is evolve a ratio of condition. And so when we go out and capture the data on all the buildings and all the systems in the buildings, they collectively have a value. Now, you could sum up the cost of all those systems and generate a replacement value based on that, and then compare the deferred maintenance to it. We swagged it at about $250 a square foot as the value of the systems in the building, not to be confused with an insurance replacement cost or a cost of replacing a building. It's simply the value of those systems, so that the numerator and the denominator of the FCI account for more or less the same cost factors. The second question in there was, how do we derive costs? So we have a sophisticated cost library that's based on a couple of different industry sources, RS Means being one of them, and Whitestone CBRE being the second one, as well as some Marshall and Swift type costs and some costs that we build internally ourselves through our project management plan. So somebody just said, but you label as replacement value. It's an industry term. I understand. We can debate whether those things totally make sense. The science in the industry is that the facility condition index is the deferred maintenance divided by the current replacement value. That's just how it's characterized. So don't shoot the messenger. But back to the costs. I think the way you have to view these costs are that they're not intended to be a project replacement cost. So if we have a recommendation in your building to replace a boiler, and the boiler is, we say $80,000, you're going to want to take a look at what's really involved, because you're going to want to take a look at the design, the capacity, redundancy, the demolition, the disposal, and what type of boiler you're going to replace that with. 80,000 is really a planning number, but if you're going to actually plan to replace that, you're going to want to get some estimates, and it's probably we find somewhere 50 to even 100% more, depending on what the situation is. There's so many factors that go into replacements and renewals that it's really difficult to peg it with, with a walkthrough in a day. So that's where the cost came from. And we could talk more about that at the end. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, and exactly. I think that we can dive into this more in the Q&A, but again, this is where I want to point us back to the purpose of a statewide assessment. So there's the difference between actually planning to do a specific renovation or construction project versus a statewide assessment that is meant to look at a portfolio of school buildings. So let's keep moving on here so that we can get through the whole report. And remember, we've got that time at the end for additional questions. Thank you.
All right. So next, this is really just kind of now getting into sort of the meat and potatoes of the report, if you will. Again, it goes from general to specific. So we're talking about some, high level concept statements about what's there. Then we talk about the FCI. Now we get into a list of the systems on the left, and then a time frame across the top. So this cross-tabular report is telling you for your roofing systems over the next 20 years, you don't have any in this building. That's a good thing. It must be a pretty new roof, obviously. But if you look at your interiors, you're okay for the moment. You don't have any near-term findings. But beginning in years 6 through 10, you have some issues with your interiors that get kind of worse over years 11 to 20. And there's the systems on the left are a roll up. So in other words, in your interiors there, you may have floor finishes, you may have wall finishes, ceiling finishes rolled into those numbers. In other words, there's a number of assets that comprise those costs and the timing with which they require replacement. Now you will see at the end of the report, and I haven't put it into this presentation, a very expanded view of this same report that lists every asset to the left and lists every year after 20 years on the top. And it's a large chart, but you'll see the same number at the bottom. It'll be $2.4 million over 20 years. You'll just see a lot more detail as what's involved there. And so the next slide, just what you'll see in the report as far as what we call in the supplemental evaluations. These are the ones that, some of the ones that PCI took on, which is the square foot verification. In other words, they went and looked on Google Earth and verified that the square footage we were reporting was more or less correct. If it was substantially off, we asserted that. There were times we actually had to go out to the school and do physical takeoffs to get the correct square footage. But basically, you can be confident that the square footage of reporting is fairly accurate now because it's been verified. Again, PCB indoor air testing. This was done as a separate exercise, but we're reporting what the findings were. Now, you'll notice in your data, if you did have a finding of PCB testing that was above the limit, what we did attempt to do was to estimate the magnitude of what that looked like. So for those that did have a finding over the limit, you will see a recommendation in your report that talks about a planning cost for remediation of PCBs. I'm going to tell you straight up, it's $500 a square foot times an estimated square footage that's impacted. Strictly a planning number. Can't go to the bank with it, but it does assert that there's some issues with PCB that do need to be addressed. The capacity and programming.
Tom, sorry, just to add one more thing. So that PCB indoor air testing section was at the time of the assessment. So you may be receiving it right now. You may have gotten your results last week. That's not reflected in this point in time report. And again, as Tom said, we're reiterating, I can talk about PCBs forever, but it's a planning cost because we needed a placeholder dollar value. It was a requirement of Act 72. And so these two things did not align. So that's what that is. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jill. And then in the educational capacity and programming space, this was really a checklist that we did that identified, a general level of adequacy. And so you'll see a statement, and that was a input that was made by each of the schools. So that was really self-reported. There was a question in there. I'll just take it really quick about escalation. I think right now we have a 3% escalation in the data. We can talk a little bit more about that. Bob and Jill and I have talked a little bit more about what would be a more appropriate escalation. We can talk more about that later. So next slide is the STEM STEAM evaluation. This was, again, another checklist. And what we're looking for here is whether the STEM STEAM facilities exist in the building and to what degree they exist. This is the snapshot of the findings. You'll find a more detailed evaluation in the appendices of the report that show how the questions were answered and how that scoring was evolved. In this particular building, there really is no dedicated STEM STEAM space, and so the suitability score in terms of the spaces and the configurations to meet the STEM STEAM program really don't exist in this building. That doesn't mean they're not being delivered. Doesn't mean that some other space is being used to deliver those. It obviously is at some level, but in terms of what's expected to promote that, the facilities just don't exist there. So, next, we get into the energy audit, and there's a lot of detail here. I'm going to try to cover kind of what these various charts mean. The first thing is we've identified what you're using for your different, what type of utilities you have and what the average rate is for those things. So in this case, this school is using electricity, propane, number 2, fuel oil, and obviously water and sewer, which is on site, so there's no cost for that. But these are the average costs that you're paying when we gather the data, how many meters you have, and that sort of thing. The next slide talks about what your consumption profile is. And so I think we were asking for 2 years of data on this, and this may be an average of those. But basically, it's how many kilowatts, in this case, for electrical consumption, how many kilowatts you're using in what time frame, what the cost per kilowatt hour is, and what the total cost is. And you'll see one of these charts for each of the utilities that you use as applicable. In other words, if you have costs or you have metering, we are able to gauge that. You'll see a cost for each of these. So you'll see propane here, number 2, fuel oil, you would also see, and so forth. The next slide is what we call the ECM analysis, all right? And these are energy conservation measures. So part of the energy audit was a recommendation of what things could you do to improve the consumption, the efficiency, water savings, and things like that. So we have a number of ECMs, energy conservation measures, that we're recommending. You may see, if you're in a new building that's very modern and efficient, you may not see any recommendations. If you're in an older building, you'll probably see a few more. But basically what this is saying is we're recommending that you spend $53,600 on these measures, and that as a result of doing that, you're going to save $3,600 per year. And if you divide 53 by 36, you see that the payback on that investment is about 15 years. So not a great payback necessarily in this particular situation, but what's built into those is some of the recommendations may have a nearer term payback and may make a lot more sense. But as a result, you'd be saving 17% in your energy savings as a result of that. And then your cost savings would be about 11% based on this analysis. The next slide shows basically what would happen or what we project would happen as a result of implementing these ECMs. So your current site energy usage here, the intensity is 63 kilobTUs per square foot. That's what you're using annually to heat and cool and provide electricity to the building. As a result of the energy efficiency conservation measures, the ECMs, you'd knock that down from 63 to 52 in the intensity. And you know, it has cost information. You would go from $1.97 a square foot on cost intensity to 175 and so forth. And then it shows your greenhouse gas emissions and what the impact of CO2 is and so forth. So that's really again, if you did all of those, that's the projection of what you would incorporate. The next slide shows the details of that. And this, I know this is gonna be hard to read, but there's 3 ECMs in this building, and it shows across the top various things: the estimated annual savings, the simple payback in number of years, how much you're going to save annually, how much you're going to save over the life of the building, and then it's all rolled up at the bottom. And so you can pick and choose which one of those may make sense. Obviously, shorter term paybacks are bigger bang for the buck because you realize the benefits sooner, but that doesn't mean that the longer term ones aren't worth doing or considering anyway. So that's really sort of the end of the PowerPoint portion of the report presentation. There's a lot more to the reports, and so I wanted to pull one up here and just kind of walk through page by page. Now, these reports are, you know, many pages, you know, 50 to 70 to 80 or even 90 pages. And so we're not going to have time to focus on each page. But what I've showed you in the PowerPoint are really the most salient pieces, the things you want to kind of focus on. So let me go ahead and open up the report. And by the way, let me share my screen. There are 2 different flavors, if you will, of reports. Most of the people on this call are going to receive a single building level report, which is what we're showing right here. And the single building level report is exactly what it is. We looked at a building, the building itself is all contained within this report. Anthony's going to show, after I walk through this report, what we call a campus style report. Now, there are cases where you have a piece of property that's named as a school, but there are actually 6 buildings on that piece of property. They're all pretty small, and they're collectively known as a school. What we did was we evaluated all 6 of those buildings individually, but we incorporated them into one report. So all your findings are in one place, but you'll have different sections on each of those buildings. The other case you might see that is if you had a middle and a high school that were collectively the same building. Maybe there was an addition, and so we would evaluate those as 2 separate buildings, but they were really, really in the end one building. So that would be a campus style report as well. So again, when you get your report, there's a cover page. Take a look at this, make sure all the information is correct, the address, the name is spelled correctly, things like that. You'll get into the table of contents. It's a PDF, so you'll be able to, I believe, navigate down to the different sections through the navigation in the PDF. But it starts with an executive summary, and there's various information which I covered, the narrative, the FCI analysis, plan types, and immediate needs, right, which we've talked about. Those are all within section 1, the executive summary. You'll get into building and site information, and we'll just show what that looks like. Then there's the supplemental evaluations, the square foot, PCB, capacity. And then you just get into some more, and again, it goes from the general to the specific. By the time you get down to the appendices, you'll see that all of the detailed information is contained in the appendices. And there's a lot to digest there, but it's really all valuable information. And I would recommend that you kind of start with the general, digest that, and then start looking into the specifics as appropriate. We talked about the sort of overview of the property. You'll see this table in the report that, and then identifies what's there, how big it is, when it was built, and that sort of thing. Every building, by the way, has GPS coordinates. That was one of the requirements. So we took the GPS readings on site, and we also verified the address through the 911 protocol, which was another requirement of the program. Again, you'll see a narrative about the, what's there and generally what condition things are in. We may have statements in this section about things that are concerning. Again, if you see terms in here like failed or failing, remember what I said about what that context means. Failed doesn't mean the thing broke apart and is laying in pieces. It means that it's not performing the way it's designed, and it's not really adequate for its mission based on capacity, its ability to, for example, a boiler to meet the requirements of the very coldest days of the year could be characterized as a failing system, for example. We get into the FCI. Again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. These are things that were in the PowerPoint, but you'll see the individual analysis of the FCI and then the projection of what happens to the FCI over time and what planning budgets and costs are required to remediate that and not allow the FCI to continue to grow, which is one of the key initiatives. This is the table that backs up the FCI. These are actually the costs over the 20-year period, the reserve cost, the escalation, and then the total deferred maintenance that drives that FCI over time. These are where those numbers come from. Okay, and so you can see the detail behind that. We get into the plan types. Again, this is the reason or the nature of why we are citing something. The vast majority of things that you're going to see are going to be classified as life cycle renewal. And you see that in this donut chart down here. And that's because, again, as we look at, let's just say, any system, let's say you have terrazzo floors and they're in serviceable, fair condition, but at some point they're going to need renewal. But otherwise they're fine. Well, that's not a safety issue. It's not a performance integrity issue, right? They're not cracking and breaking, falling apart. There's not necessarily an accessibility issue. There's not an environmental issue. There's not a retrofit adaptation issue. So it defaults to life cycle renewal. And that's really just the way that the data settles out. So expect to see most of your findings in life cycle renewal. And then you'll see that there's some retrofit adaptation recommendations here, some performance integrity that's really the things that drive the facility condition index. And then you have some accessibility related issues potentially here too. We talked about immediate need. Yes. Sorry, was there a question? No. Okay. We talked about immediate needs. And so these are the two findings that are in the $88,000 that are, that are driving the FCI today. In other words, this constitutes the numerator of the FCI, as we talked about. Those are the two items. Then you get into your key findings. Again, these are the things that are not in the FCI, but they're coming down the pike, or they're sort of noteworthy issues, things that, you want to start thinking about. Maybe not necessarily critical today, but, your parking lots are in relatively poor condition. You can see here that this athletic surface is starting to spall and, unsightly and things like that. Then we get into the building.
Tom,
Yes,
hey, it's Jill. I know I told you to go through the whole report, and so that's on me. But I want to make sure we have time for the next steps because I know folks have questions about if they find errors, and then also open up to questions. So, is there anything that you think is super critical here that you haven't already talked about in the slide deck? And I apologize.
That's quite all right. I think that, really I just wanted to show sort of what else is in the report, and I can kind of skim through it. This is a section I think is useful because we talk about each of the systems, the structure, facade, roof, interiors, and we've given it a conditional statement and just sort of asserting what it is. You'll get down to, I'm going to skip some of this stuff. I already showed it. You'll get into a photo log. There's a statement about ADA. We didn't do a full-blown ADA accessibility assessment. We did a checklist to look for things that are, red flag type things. So there's a chart on that. There's some boilerplate that just describes the process and so forth, and then what the costs come from, things like that. The energy audit, that's a pretty lengthy. I've covered that. I recommend that you spend some time looking through that. And then you get to the appendices, and this is where you'll see, and I won't go any further than this, but you'll see a number of photographs. Seeing is believing, pictures worth 1,000 words. You see a site plan, where is this physically or geographically located, the details of the STEM and STEAM, the accessibility report, and then you get into the component condition report, reserve replacements, and depleted value report, which really are the most granular level of information that's in this report. There's a lot there, as you'll see. So that's really all I wanted to do. Anthony, can you do 5 minutes on, and I can pull up the report if you want, just kind of showing the differences between the campus style and the single report?
Absolutely. If you'll go to the table of contents page, it'll be the easiest place for me to explain it. What we did in the report, let me explain, there's two reasons why we would generate a campus report. One would be based upon numerous buildings located on one site, geographically brought together, and we wanted to give you information by building, but we also wanted to give you an overview of how all of them are impacting the report and your resources here. The second reason that it may be a campus report is when we got into the energy evaluations, we were finding that you would have two facilities that were being fed from one meter location, one energy source, whether it be fuel, oil, whatever. And to do a fair energy evaluation, we had to incorporate all the uses and resources from both buildings, because there was no way to say, well, this building's using 40%, this building's using 60%. And so out of necessity to do a fair energy evaluation, we had to incorporate all the numbers together. And then we gave that as a campus report. So when you're looking at this report, you'll see up in the executive summary going down there to in just that first section, again, that gives you the overview, the facility condition, and we give you those on a camp. All of those are done on a campus level. All of your buildings are brought together in this report. Once you get down on this particular report to section 2 through 9, those are individual buildings. And on those, we gave your immediate needs by building, your key findings by building, your systems expenditure, your depleted values. All of those are done on a individual building basis. And then the remainder of the report, again, comes back to the campus level, where everything's combined together, especially your energy audit with all your historical values and usage and so forth, is done on an energy level. So when you look at this, just remember that when you start getting into that section 2, that starts out with a couple pictures at the top, and it starts telling you all the different parts of the building, that this is by building. And we used your building names and your building descriptions when we put that information in there, so that you could relate to which building is which. Some of them may be like, you got a wood chip plant here. That's all that is just a facility that generates the energy, but it generates energy for the whole campus. Now, there are a couple locations where we had one location on one street and another location around the corner on another street, two separate addresses. But when we guys got out there and found out that both facilities were being fed from the same energy source, so there's no logical reason why the two buildings should be in a campus report, other than the fact to utilize the best that we can and to give you the best recommendations energy-wise, most accurately. Again, we had to bring those two buildings together as a campus. So we've tried to give you the overall at the same time as give you what you can use on an individual basis to make your evaluations.
Great. Good synopsis, Anthony. And thanks for pointing out the energy piece. I think that's important. That was one of the driving factors. By the way, and I'll turn it over to Jill here in a minute, related to energy consumption, we did get most of the energy consumption data for most of the schools. Thanks to everybody for doing that. I know that was not a small undertaking, and thanks to PCI for pulling it together. For buildings that we did not get the consumption data in time, because you can imagine when we're doing 375 reports, they don't all happen on one day. They happen throughout the course of the year. Where we did not get those in the time frame that was requested, we used a statewide average for consumption values based on square footage and consumption costs. And so in those cases, you'll note that in the report, and those will need to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. because they're based on an average consumption value. So, Jill, that's all we've got for the moment. I can turn it back over to you.
Okay, that sounds great. So just in the interest of time, what we're going to focus on is sort of the next steps, and I'm going to ask Bob to discuss. So Bob, I'm going to reshare here. And you can speak to this part.
Yeah, okay. First off, Tom and Anthony, thanks. That was awesome explanations for so many of the different topics that have to be covered in a short time period. So I appreciate that. Okay, and just as an update to the whole crowd in general, I'm 73% of the way through getting school districts their reports. So my goal is to be 100% done by the end of business tomorrow or even sooner. So hang in there. They're coming out. It's burdensome only because there's no automated way to be able to do that. All right, so we covered a lot of here. Some questions are coming up as to how are we going to move forward with things that are identified in the reports as being problematic. So we are going to take a look at major issues that are major findings, and everyone's going to have a period of time where about a month after you get your reports that you can review your reports, come up with a list of the major findings that might be an issue, and then you can forward those to me, and then I'll talk with Tom and his team and trying to get those rectified in the reports, and then more accurate reports reissued. Because of the time crunch and the volume of work that has been done to get this all completed, there are going to be some things that are not major issues, and we will get those on the next series of changes that we'll be working on developing a process of how we go about implementing changes moving forward with the whole Asset Calc database. As part of Act 72, there were other mandates associated with that. And one of them is the 5-year capital plan, and the other one is related to facilities managers and facility manager training, which is tangential to this whole process, but will be key to everybody learning how to use Asset Calc going forward in terms of using it for all those needs. So in terms of establishing the process for the school districts to update Asset Calc on a regular cadence, we're going to be meeting actually after this meeting to discuss what is the logistics behind that, and we're trying to figure out the best way to do that. And right now, Asset Calc is very Excel compatible, so we're talking about doing some sort of formatted spreadsheet that school districts would be able to update periodically. That frequency we'll have to determine. And then at that frequency, we would then get with BVTA, and they would import that data into Asset Calc. And this is going to be really important because as we go through various pieces of equipment and their upgrades, when you replace those and we update Asset Calc appropriately, it keeps that remaining useful life clock ticking, so that the value of that asset and its time left for service is going to really be key and tie into your 5-year capital plan development going forward. And that's really where the meat of this whole project, as Jill and Tom alluded to earlier in the discussion, is the database that's been generated through all of this work is really what's going to be the springboard that we use to look forward in the state to say, how much money are we looking at in terms of doing appropriate maintenance if we're going to not let things fall behind and become deferred maintenance issues, but through an active program of looking forward based upon the data, projecting what our capital reserve replacement spending plans are going to be. And I think that's where, as a consumer of this, if I was a facilities manager or a business officer or a superintendent, I'd be saying the data is what's going to drive the discussion going forward about how we're going to allocate resources. And even though we may disagree with remaining useful life and something's assessment in the current state, we can use the database in Asset Calc in a smart way, because if we know we have a roof that's going to be rescheduled in 2 years, and the air handlers on the roof are to be rescheduled to be replaced in 4 years, all of us should be thinking, well, it doesn't make sense to put a new roof on just to be 2 years later suspending a large heavy load over the roof. So there'll be the flexibility where we can talk about something that's scheduled in 5 years and something that's scheduled in 7 years. If they're related, let's do a bigger comprehensive plan to do all that work in one major shutdown. And therefore, it makes more sense logistically. And now we can prepare for that from a cost standpoint with the arguments in place that are logical based upon the data that we have to work with. And then
So,
going
Bob,
forward, yeah,
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm going to jump in real quick. So I just want to make sure that folks caught this. So
okay,
if there are major factual errors, right? So we're talking about things like the wrong org ID, the wrong name. There was an issue with square footage. It says there, someone pulled the wrong thing on the pull down menu, and it says that the roof is old, but it's actually brand new. The major issues. So the process here is going to be that all the reports will be out, as Bob said, by end of week. SUSDs will have 1 month to review the data in their facilities assessment reports. We're asking that you assign one person, so not each person in your school is going to email Bob with their specific thing. With one person, collect the information. We'll either do this via email or web form, and we'll be sending out communication to all of you on this. Include the system ID number, right? Your report has that, the description of the error and what the corrected data should be. And then Bob will communicate, as he said, the needed update to the BVTA team. And then the BVTA team will update Asset Calc and reissue the building assessment report by January 15th, 2024. As Bob was saying, there's might be many small things, or maybe you've already made an update to a system since the assessment was done. That's going to be an ongoing, we're talking about years in the future process, right? Where we'll have a specific cadence when updates are going to be made to Asset Calc. And again, that's just that reminder that Asset Calc, the database, is the entree. The report is the salad course, right? And so that's what we really want to focus on, is we now have access to a really powerful database that can drive all of the other work that Bob was just pointing to. So I'm going to allow us to have a little bit of time. We're a little bit short. There was a ton of information. We probably could have made this a 3-hour webinar and it would have been still a good idea. But again, a lot more work to come here. We now all have a statewide assessment that uses the same methodology. I hope that this presentation has been helpful for folks in understanding how to digest this information. And we understand that, like, communication wise, it's a complicated report, and you're going to need to be able to communicate with folks within your community, and we're here to help support that communication. And then also critically, you are going to be hearing from Bob on the next steps of how we're going to use this information. So this is not the end point. A lot more to come as we're taking the information in Asset Calc, using tools to turn it into your 5-year capital plan, and talking about all of the other elements of Act 72. The facilities assessment does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of a much larger sort of comprehensive approach here. So all that said, thank you for bearing with us.